We believe we have a mandate to bring godly change to our nation and the world through the 7 spheres or mountains of influence. Our mission is to deliver the truth of God's kingdom and unite the body of Christ with the world at large, and to catalyze a movement that promotes the true reformation of nations through the teachings of Jesus Christ. Welcome to the Truth and Liberty broadcast, brought to you by 7M Ventures and Andrew Wommack Ministries.
Hello, I'm Andrew Wommack, and welcome to our live Truth and Liberty broadcast. We are broadcasting from our lodge here in Woodland Park. This is a part of our Charis Bible College facility, and we hold these live casts every Monday night now. We started out every other Monday, but man, we've had a great response, and I feel like it's making a difference.
I think so too, Andrew.
So it's awesome. And anyway, this is Karen Conrad. She's on staff with us here. She runs a lot of things in our ministry. Just has been a tremendous blessing. And she's going to give us a lot of information about how you can participate. But let me just real quickly say that we have David Barton with us. And he is by, what do we call this? Sky. It's not a Skype.
Yeah,
but
remote in. We have him remote in.
All right, so he's remote, but he's with us. And man, David Barton is, I believe, one of the greatest authorities on American history,
Yes.
and of course, applying all of the ways that our nation was founded to what's happening today. And we've got a lot of things to discuss with David. So he's live with us from Aledo, Texas. Is that right, David?
That's right, sir. Yes, sir. Aledo, Texas.
And you can see behind him, man, he's got all of his flags and colonial garb behind him. David is a patriot. So we're going to have a great time. But Karen, tell us how people can get involved.
All right. So thank you so much for joining us tonight for Truth and Liberty. And we are so excited to have David Barton on. As a matter of fact, Andrew, you and I have been quizzing him this whole time.
Yes. We've already had a 30-minute interview
We have.
with David.
Anytime we get David, we're asking him questions and learning ourselves. So we're really glad to have you with us, David. Thank you. So,
My pleasure.
We want to welcome you to truthandliberty.net, and we give you an opportunity to actually engage and ask questions. So I'm going to give you some information. You can go to truthandliberty.net, and I want to encourage you to subscribe on the website, and you'll get updates, so you'll find out about guests like David Barton. Also, we want you to be able to chat and to ask questions. So if you're on truthandliberty.net, you can go to the right of the video that you're seeing and you can type in your question. If you are joining us on Facebook or Twitter, you can just go ahead in the feed and you can ask questions, and we've got a whole team standing by, and they send those questions in, and we'll answer as many of them as possible. Also,
and before you leave that, Karen, let
Yes.
me just say that not only is David, this is not his first time to be with us, but we have Lance Wallnau with us. We've had Congressman
Yes.
Bob McEwen, Randy Forbes, who else? And we've got Huckabee coming up.
Yes, William Federer.
Yeah, William Federer, and
We had Mark Coward on.
yeah, it's been awesome. So this is totally different than what we typically do, and the guests that have come on, they just are really into this. We need to get this information out to our people. So you need to subscribe and be a part of this.
Absolutely. Thank you. And also, if you do subscribe on truthandliberty.net, we have a free giveaway every week. And so tonight we are giving away, David, we've got your product called Constitution Alive, a citizen's guide to the Constitution set. And our winner tonight is Elaine Stain. So Elaine, we want to congratulate you, and we'll get that sent out to you shortly. Also, I want to make you aware that we've got the archive. So if people did miss a previous broadcast, on truthandliberty.net, you can click on archives and you can see all of the previous live casts. And also, we'll be talking about several things that are in the news right now. And we've got a lot of different articles. And on truthandliberty.net, you can go right below the video and you can see the articles that we will be discussing. And so, Andrew and David, we have people from all over the world on tonight. I was looking at the list of states. I think we have almost all 50 states represented. So I'll just name a few of them. We want to welcome Pennsylvania, Florida, Indiana, Arizona, Washington, Michigan, and many, many more. Then also, we've attracted a really strong worldwide audience.
You know, I had some people that came to our Summer Family Bible Conference that are from overseas, and they said they never miss one of these. They love it, even though they aren't living in the U.S.
Well, that's awesome. And Truth and Liberty Liberty, of course, is about a global influence. And so it's encouraging that there's a lot of interest. So tonight I want to welcome South Africa, Canada, New Zealand, Philippines, Mexico, India. We're so glad to have you. And every time we do the Truth and Liberty live cast, we have prayer ministers standing by. So if you need prayer or if you have questions on something that we're talking about, you can call 719-635-1111 and we will be glad to visit with you and pray with you. So, Andrew, we have got a lot to cover tonight.
Let me just say one other thing, that this is a listener or viewer supported broadcast. It does cost us money to do these things. And so they can either go to that prayer center, 719-635-1111, and they can contribute that way, or there's a place on the website.
Yeah, you can go to truthandliberty.net and you can click on donate. And we are so grateful if you're enjoying these that you could support us.
Yep. So, David, it is just a blessing to have you with us, brother. And so we want to talk about this judicial activism, and you just happen to have a book on that. You got a book on everything. So
I do have a book on judicial activism. It's interesting that was a real concern of the Founding Fathers. As you go through school today, we are told that America separated from Great Britain because of taxation without representation. Now, the problem with that is they gave 27 reasons they separated, 27 grievances. Taxation without representation was number 17 of the 27, so it wasn't in the top half for them. 4 of those grievances dealt with judicial abuses. Way back, starting in 1765, a decade before the American Revolution, Founding Fathers like Sam Adams started this move that said, hey, these British judges, they have lifetime appointments and they're unaccountable, and we can't have judges like that. Now, today we hear that federal judges have lifetime appointments. No. Article 3, Section 2 says they get to serve for the duration of good behavior. They do not get lifetime appointments. So it's interesting that judicial activism, something they were very, very concerned about back then. They experienced it under British judges. They did not like it, and they made sure to give us ways that we didn't have to put up with that today. But because we really don't know our documents very well, we get stuck with a lot of it.
David, before we get more into that, could you just define judicial activism? We throw these terms around, and I have a vague understanding, but it'd sure help for you to just make it clear.
Judicial activism is when a judge wants to implement his own personal beliefs and policy and makes policy. No judge is supposed to make policy. All the judge can make policy for is for the judges under his control, not the positions, not the issues. The legislature is the one who passes the laws and makes policy. Judges do not. So anytime a judge makes policy, then that's judicial activism. Anytime a judge comes through and says, well, I don't think marriage should be between a man and a woman, it doesn't matter what you think. That's not what you were put there for. So when they start imposing their personal beliefs and values, you have judicial activism. They're acting as a legislator. So short line, anything that makes policy is judicial activism.
And this is pretty much how that the liberal has made all of their inroads in the last, say, 50 plus years or so, is through the judicial thing. The main portion of the American population has not been for all of these things that the Supreme Court has been pushing through.
Well, there's an individual named Michael Newdow. He was very famous as an atheist. He sued in California to get under God, out from under the pledge. He didn't want that for his daughter, etc. And he lost the case. But he said, I went to courts because I recognize that I can never win this on a vote of the people. People aren't here. The only way I can get my policy done is to go to courts. And so he has been litigating issue after issue after issue, case after case after case for years and win some, but he could never win them if it was up to the people to make the policy or up to their legislatures to make the policy.
And that's the same thing that happened with taking prayer out of the schools. I don't think that was popular. It was a judicial decision.
Well, when they took prayer out of schools, it was so unpopular, they actually had hearings in the Congress about whether to impeach the Supreme Court justices who took the prayer out of schools. It's also interesting that when they took prayer out of schools, the court acknowledged that and it was voluntary prayer, by the way. People often say, well, they were forcing those kids in New York to pray. No, they weren't. No. The court said that it was voluntary prayer. And so the court said that what they did was without precedent. There was no previous decision in the history of the United States that said you can't pray at schools. And that's another way you know it's judicial activism. They created their own policy, overturned at that point 320 years of public school policy. Our first public school law, 1647, 320 years of public school policy to get where they wanted to go.
And David, this is where your ministry is so vital, is because I've heard my whole life that Supreme Court justices are appointed for life and that there's nothing you can do. And see, you go back and show that that isn't the way it originally was. And then all of these other things, I've learned a lot through you about how important Christianity, prayer, morality was to the founding of this nation. And if they truly went back to precedent, and I just read something in the last week that Thomas Jefferson was giving guidelines after he left the presidency about how people should interpret the Constitution. And it was, my summary is basically they should go back and get as close to the way those people were thinking who wrote the Constitution and not interpret it in the light of where we are today. So you bring these things out that most people don't know this stuff.
Yeah, they were really strong in original intent, and they talked about how that you want to interpret the laws on the basis of how they were ratified at the time, when they were passed and ratified. And so it's very easy to take laws today. I'll give you a good example. We had at the Supreme Court 3 years ago. This is part of what we call overcriminalization. There was a fisherman down in Florida who was out catching fish. He came in, and one of the fish inspectors said, "I want to see your catch." And he looked at it and said, "I think you've got maybe 80 fish in here that are undersized. Let's get back together on Monday and let's see how many you have." When they got back together on Monday, it was like 4 fish shorter than what he thought were going to be there. Maybe it's 75 or whatever. So what they did, the federal prosecutor, now in Florida, if you commit an offense like this, it's a $500 fine. So a federal prosecutor got involved and used the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed after Enron to keep you from shredding documents to hide a crime. And they said, "Oh, you dumped those 4 fish overboard. That's the same as shredding documents." Suddenly, he was looking at 20 years in jail. It was a felony 20. That was never what that law was passed for. That was not the original intent of that law. And they've taken a law that was never designed to do that, and they've suddenly applied it to, and when you apply a law other than the way it's interpreted, you will get abuse, you will get tyranny out of it. And that's why you always go back to original intent, see what it was designed to do.
But you know, I read something about the potential of Roe versus Wade being overturned if Kavanaugh was to be confirmed. This is the fear of a lot of people. And so they were coming back and they were saying, but this would be overturning, I forgot, 36 years worth of precedent of abortion. And so they were big on precedent, but they only went back 36 years instead of 200 plus years.
Yeah, if you want to talk about precedent, let's talk about the first 180 years where the abortion was illegal because it violated the laws of nature and nature's God right in our documents. Mm-hmm. So the Declaration says you have an inalienable right to life and government should protect the right to life. And that also meant unborn children. And we have signers of the Constitution who wrote about that unborn life is part of the right to life that you protect.
So I just think we need to point out to the people who are viewing this that if they hear this argument that what about precedent? What about judicial precedent? Instead of looking over the last 36 years, we need to look at the last 200
That's right.
and 40 years or whatever.
That's right. I mean, if you want to talk about judicial precedent, why don't we go back to the unanimous decision by the U.S. Supreme Court that said if you're a government-funded school, you have to teach the Bible in schools. Mm-hmm. Now, we had that until 1963, and that was the unanimous decision of the court. And why did the 63 court feel like they should overturn that? Well, where's precedent at that point? They should have been looking at the precedent. Mm-hmm. So what happens is when people say follow the precedent, usually means follow the decisions I like and ignore the ones I don't like.
That's exactly true. So let's talk about Kavanaugh that has been appointed by Trump to be the replacement on the Supreme Court. You're going to hear a lot about people saying he's an activist. What is your opinion on that, David?
He is so active, he's going to go back to the Constitution. and what an activist that is. Yeah. He's the kind of activist we want. He's going to be active against judicial activism. He has a record of that. This is the one thing President Trump promises: whoever he nominates will have a confirmed record that you can look at. And so he is an activist, and that he goes back to original intent. which means a lot of the nonsense of the last couple of decades where they've been trying to reshape the culture and do social engineering, he's not going to put up with. He recognizes judges do not make policy, the Congress does, and that's where he's headed back to. So that makes him an activist against the activists, but it puts him back on the side of the Constitution and back on the side of the people.
Well, I know that a lot of people watching would want to hear just your opinion of him. You've probably read enough, researched him enough that you have an opinion on him. What do you think?
This was one of the greatest debates in my lifetime, because the debate was, well, should it be Hardiman? Should it be Kavanaugh? Should it be Barrett? Should it be Mike Lee? Who should it be? And we were arguing over whether it should be 99.7% good, 99.3% good, 99.6% good. I mean, all the arguments were over minor. Well, I think that Amy Barrett would be more likely to do a frontal assault against abortion. Kavanaugh is probably going to hold up the states' rights and do around there. It doesn't matter. They both get it done. It's just different ways of going at it. So it was a fun debate in that we were not talking about someone who's radically off, who every one of these were good and have decisions. But, to go past Kavanaugh for a minute, Kavanaugh is what's in the news. I'm going to suggest that what's not in the news is really more important than Kavanaugh. Folks don't recognize, but 99% of all federal court decisions are not made by the U.S. Supreme Court. They're made at lower courts. U.S. Supreme Court, there will be 400,000 cases in the federal courts, and the U.S. Supreme Court will only take 60 of those cases. So most decisions are made down under, and most of the decisions are made by the 13 Supreme Courts at the circuit court level. 99% of the decisions of the Ninth Circuit, it's going to be the final decision. At the Seventh Circuit, the Third Circuit, Fifth Circuit. So you really, when you look at it, yeah, you've got a U.S. Supreme Court, and that's what the media focuses on, and that's what we look at. But it's those lower courts that are going to make 99% of decisions. And so what's happened is, so far under Trump, he has had 42 judges confirmed to the courts. Now, he's nominated 128 judges. Let me back up for a minute. What you have is there's 874 federal judicial judgeships. Out of that, you have 139 vacancies and another 30 that have announced that they're going to leave. So you're looking at about 170 open spots out of 874. So at this point, Trump has already made 128 nominees. There are some more retiring. He's got about 80 more to go. Out of the 128 nominees he's made, 42 have been confirmed. Now, you have what are called district court judges. That's the lowest level. Then you have next the Court of Appeals judges, which is that Supreme Court at the regional level. And then he's made 2 Supreme Court nominations. You have Gorsuch, and now you have Kavanaugh. Now, Kavanaugh's not been confirmed, but Gorsuch has been. So what you look, that's 42 confirmations. And to the credit of the Senate, they have spent all their time trying to confirm the Court of Appeals nominations. So what you have right now is Trump has already made almost 30%. Trump has appointed nearly 30% of the judges at the Court of Appeals level. So he's only been in less than 2 years. And that's the most ever for any president in his first year and a half. He's got more Court of Appeals judges appointed. Here's the difference it makes. If you look at a place like the Ninth Circuit, and I call them the Ninth Circus because their decisions are so crazy.
I agree.
So the Ninth Circuit, there's 54 million Americans under that. I think there's 7 states there. There's Hawaii and Alaska, and there's Idaho and Washington and Nevada and California and Oregon, et cetera. Currently, before Trump came in, there were 17 Democrat-appointed justices on the Ninth Circuit, and there were 6 Republican-appointed justices on the Ninth Circuit. So 17 to 6. What you have now is it is now 17 to 13. So even though Trump has not turned that court over, he's brought a whole lot back. And the way the Court of Appeals works is out of those 25, 30 judges, however many it is on each circuit, they will pick 3 judges at a time. Random pick. The computer will pick 3. Well, when almost half of them have been appointed by Republicans, you got a 50-50 chance of getting a pretty good decision out of those guys, as opposed to now where that it's like a 1 out of 4 shot. So when you look at a court like the Third Circuit, and the Third Circuit is over Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, Trump has already flipped that circuit. It has now gone to a Republican direction. When you look at the Seventh Circuit, it's Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin. That is about to be flipped. You look at the Fifth Circuit, it had been liberal. It has now gone to conservative. And you look at these judges, and I'll tell you how wild this is. Andrew, I'm sitting here surrounded with our library collection. This is where we have 120,000 documents from before 1812. So we're talking the George Washington, Adams, Jefferson stuff. We just had federal judge in here with all of his staff being trained on original intent and founding fathers.
Praise God. That's
so
awesome.
when you start getting federal judges coming here to get original intent, you've got a whole different kind of judge being appointed. And so that's part of what's going on. And Kavanaugh is the one we see up here. But I'm telling you, what's going on down under here is absolutely remarkable stuff. The fights that are going on in the Senate over this, the Senate does not like, the Democrats in the Senate do not like this. And they have used every conceivable tool. One of them is what's called cloture. That's Rule 22 of the Senate rules. That was a rule added in 1918. Grab this. Since 1918, cloture has been used an average of 8 times a year. Under Trump, it's been used more than 120 times.
Wow.
They have used that to try to block all of these nominees from going forward. At the rate they have been blocking, let's see if I can say this right here. When it comes to nominees, Obama in his first 6 months got 200 nominees confirmed at the executive level. Trump had, I think, 31. At the rate the Senate is confirming his nominees, it will take 11 years to confirm his nominees.
And David, let me just point out, I know you know this, but the people watching, that this is the reason it is so critical that we not stop and feel like, well, look at the progress we're making and not participate in these midterm elections. Because unless we get the obstructionist out of there, the potential is not going to happen unless we get a greater majority in these midterm elections.
That's a great point.
Well, I'll point out that right now the House has passed over 400 measures that the Senate has refused to pick up. And over 200 of those measures were passed by 400 votes in the House. That means Republicans and Democrats are both together, because you've only got about 190 Democrats. And so you have over 200 bills that are extremely bipartisan, almost unanimous in the House, and we can't even get them picked up in the Senate.
And David, am I correct in understanding that if the Senate doesn't act on these by the time that Congress recesses, well, then they die and it's got to be started over again? So they are basically killing these things, not just delaying it. They're killing all of this legislation.
Yeah, we're told there's all this polarization in Washington, D.C. No, you're having all these bills passed with huge bipartisan support because they're good for America. It's the Democrats in the Senate that are playing the partisanship and the polarization. And so they're slowing every single thing down they can. You're right, Andrew. These elections, I think, are the most crucial. I hate that we have to keep saying this, the most important in my lifetime, but the stakes keep going up.
They do.
I mean,
would it be accurate to say that if we lose anything in these midterm elections, that basically whatever good we've seen is going to be totally overturned?
Well, I don't think it'll be overturned, but it won't go forward anymore. It'll stop right where it is.
Well, what I was referring to is a lot of the things that Trump has done has been executive orders, which that will be overturned if the Congress flips.
Yeah, it will, and pro-life progress. I mean, did you know that in the last 6 years, we have passed 338 state pro-life laws? Now, all that goes away if we lose control of legislatures. And I have to say, this is one of the most unimaginable things for me. What's called, we had in Congress what's called the Infant Born Alive Protection Act.
Yep.
Went through the House. That's one the Senate refused to pick up. But it says, if a child let's say you intended to abort a child and you just didn't get to it fast enough, and that child is born before you did the abortion. Once that child is out of the womb and laying on the delivery table, can you kill it on the table? It's out of the womb. Only 6 Democrats voted that you cannot kill the child on the table out of 190 or so Democrats. Only 6. It was 93% of Democrats in Congress said, yes, kill the child on the table. Are you kidding me?
Goodness.
You know, David, I had a woman on my television program that I interviewed during the Roe versus Wade anniversary in January, and she was aborted by her grandmother. Her grandmother was a nurse and aborted her, but she came out alive, and they threw her in a closet, and one of the custodians found her and saved her life.
Wow.
But she is a survivor of exactly what you're talking about. And to think that a person would just kill a baby because it was unwanted, that's murder.
And if Christian folks do not get up and show up and vote in 2018, because I'll tell you, the other side is very aware of the fact that if they lose the judges, if they lose the life battle, if they lose all this stuff, man, their agenda is sit back 50 years. And so they are fighting the turnouts they have had in all the elections thus far. And normally their turnout goes down in non-presidential year elections. Well, now it's up higher than it's been and whoever. And if our guys do not show up to say, we're going to show up too, and by the way, we're going to keep this trend going because look at what the economics are doing. Look at the relations with Israel. Look at what's happening across the world. Peace being brought to regions that had war for a number of years. We want this to keep going. If our guys don't show up in this election for the House and the Senate, we will have stopped a beautiful opportunity to turn this thing around.
So, David, let me ask you this. If say, the judges do change and we got legislation that would put an end to Roe versus Wade, and I understand it that in the original Roe versus Wade decision, there was some statement about that this decision was made because they couldn't prove that a child in the mother's womb was a human being. But if you could prove that, immediately Roe versus Wade is null and void. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. This has been tried a number of times in the courts, and they keep giving themselves caveats. In original Roe v. Wade, there was this viability thing that says, well, we think viability is about 20 weeks because that's when you could live outside the womb. So we think that's when you're really human, is when you're outside the womb. Well, since then, technology is so advanced that we're now doing all this prenatal surgery on just few-week-old infants in the womb, actually doing surgery. The heartbeats, you get by 6 weeks, you get a heartbeat. They're producing blood within just a few weeks. And so the measurements have completely changed. And they keep going back into courts with these new measurements. It's, hey, we've got a heartbeat. Let's do a heartbeat bill. And the court says, no. Roe v. Wade gave you unlimited abortion on demand for any reason. You can't stop that. So they no longer look at that viability clause. They no longer look at when they become human. They're just saying Roe v. Wade gives you unlimited abortion on demand through all 9 months. I mean, if you looked at viability, which is what the court said, you would not have partial birth abortions or third-term abortions or even second-term abortions. Yeah. You would end at the first trimester. So they ignore Roe v. Wade, what it actually said, and they just take that as a blanket for abortion anytime we want it for any reason.
So let me ask you this. The one compliment that I can give the left is that they seem to be more committed to their cause than what the conservatives are. And they are so up in arms that if the Supreme Court were to reverse this and overturn abortion on demand, man, there would be a radical response. How do you respond to that potential?
You know, it's interesting. It's interesting to me that recent polling shows that more than half of millennials did not know that abortion and Roe v. Wade were the same thing. So they've been told they've got to preserve Roe v. Wade, but they're pro-life. So they have this oxymoronic thing going on where they are pro-life at a very high level. It's the most pro-life generation we've had in modern American history is the millennials folks. But on the other side, they have huge support for Roe v. Wade, but polling shows they didn't know Roe v. Wade and abortion went together. We got polling this week from Gallup that said that over half of churchgoers have a favorable opinion of Planned Parenthood, and 1/3 of pro-life people think Planned Parenthood is a good deal.
Man.
Now, Planned Parenthood is the largest abortion provider in America. So what you're going to have is we've not been educated about a lot of this stuff. We have superficial things. And if Roe v. Wade goes down, they will say women's health has been destroyed. And people will say, oh, my gosh, we can't hurt women's health. They won't know that it deals with abortion. I mean, already half of millennials don't know that Roe v. Wade is abortion. So that's part of the education side we're going to have to do. And by the way, I mean, you got there's a couple of ways the court could go. The court could just dump Roe v. Wade and say it's out the door. What they could likely do, more likely, is say, you know, we're just giving this back to the states. The states can do what they want with this. Well, you have states in this last term that passed laws that said, if Roe v. Wade is ever overturned in this state, we will always have abortion on demand for any reason. And so seeing that this might happen, you've already got states passing pro-abortion laws. Now, on the other hand, Texas has never taken its anti-abortion law off the books. Roe v. Wade came out of Texas. That was a Texas law. And our legislators should never remove that law from the books. So if the court gives it back to the states, we'll still have the original Roe v. Wade law on the books. So it really will be state by state, and both sides are seeing that this is a possibility, and they're starting to act. We have Iowa, the governor there recently signed the most pro-life law in the nation in recent history, trying to move in that direction. And that may be the law that makes it to the court that becomes the real issue to dump Roe v. Wade in 2 or 3 years.
And David, I'll defer to you because I know that you know this stuff already, but my understanding is that there's like 600 something Planned Parenthood things across the country. They say that they provide all of these women's services, but well over 90% of everything they do is abortion. And the services that they do provide that aren't abortion, there are like 6,000 something pregnancy centers that provide those same services. Nobody would be missing the services if Planned Parenthood was defunded and out of the picture.
Yeah, I think, I don't remember exactly the stats. I think it's only 6% of Planned Parenthood clinics provide women's services other than abortion. So, you don't get a sonogram, you don't get to see the unborn child development or anything else. So they don't do much in that way. And by the way, that was a great win we had at the Supreme Court this time, where we had a law in California. It was also going in other states like Hawaii that said, if you're a pro-life crisis pregnancy center, you have to advertise and promote abortion at your center. Whoa, time out. But fortunately at the Supreme Court, that got dumped. So now that California law goes by the way. Already we were seeing the Hawaii law go by the way because Ben Carson and HHS had notified them that you having that law violates all these grant provisions and you can't do that. So we were seeing pushback from the Trump administration anyway, but now that law goes away. But you're right. I mean, it is not, women's health is not pushed by Planned Parenthood. That's just what they say they push, and that's what most people believe.
That's
why
project.
Most people have a view of them.
It's what they project, but it is not reality at all.
That's
it's
right.
a smoke screen. And anybody who's concerned about defunding Planned Parenthood needs to know that really all the $547 million that the government gave to Planned Parenthood, it funds abortions, what it does.
Well, we used to have what was called the Hyde Amendment that said no public funds can be used for abortion. And we still have almost 70% national support for no public funds being used for abortion. And yet we're given to Planned Parenthood, but people don't know that Planned Parenthood does abortions. And I mean, the polling again this week, 62% of the nation has a favorable view of Planned Parenthood.
Wow.
62%.
And man, if you go back to the founding of Margaret Sanger and her Ebonics policies and her purpose in founding Planned Parenthood was to do away with the black Americans. That was her goal in it.
Yeah, eugenics. What she did with eugenics was all about population control of inferior races. And it's just amazing. The racism's there. We see all this movement going in states to tear down Confederate statues. Okay. Has anybody read the title to Darwin's Origin of Species book? The full title of that species book talks about favored races. And Darwin is the guy who says the lighter your skin, the more evolved you are. The darker your skin, the less evolved. So why are we still teaching evolution if we're willing to tear down statues of races?
I just did a great teaching on that. It was awesome.
Biblical
Yeah,
worldview.
exactly.
It was great. Let me say one other thing about this before we leave the abortion deal. I was talking to someone and we were basically describing this same thing. And I said the liberals feel like this is their constitutional right, which it's not. But that's the way that they feel, that if it ever gets overturned, I said, man, it could be another civil war.
Oh, yeah.
And the person that I was talking to says, would that be so bad? We had one civil war to end slavery. Wow. Says, isn't this worth fighting over 60 million children that have been killed? I thought that's pretty good perspective.
That is a good perspective.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. A recent poll showed that 1/3 of Americans think that in the next 5 years, we will be in a civil war. So that's a high percentage that thinks that violence is going to erupt at a level. I don't think that. I think we got lots of alternatives and options. And I'll just be real blunt. On a normal off-year election, only 1 out of 8 Americans chooses our leaders. You got no business having a civil war if only 1 out of 8 is choosing your leaders.
That's true.
The other 7 out of 8, get off your tail and do something.
Plus, I believe that the vast majority of people are not that militant, but the Antifa and those kind of things.
Yep.
I believe that there will be militant things, and the government ought to restrict that. That's not free speech, that's terrorism.
Well, that's a problem. It goes back to another case that we had, the flag burning case back in 1972, where the U.S. Supreme Court said, oh, we think burning a flag is part of your free speech. No. If you want to talk about burning the flag, that's your free speech. But when you stick a match to it, now you're talking about behavior, and laws always regulate behavior. And so starting in 72, the court redefined what free speech is to say it's whatever you do, how you express yourself. No, speech is what I do with my mouth. Actions are what I do outside with my body. And the court suddenly convoluted all that. And so now they're saying, oh, violence, that's part of your free expression. That never tolerated in previous generations. But again, judicial activism has put us on a very dangerous course that has now opened the door to things. It's unintended consequences that's there. It's just not good.
Well, David, in the next 5 to 6, 7 minutes, we need to stop and start taking some questions. But let me ask you one thing. Let's go back to judicial activism and your book on that. What do you cover in there? What is this? What are the points you're making?
Yeah, in this book on judicial activism, what we've done is we go back to the Founding Fathers' statements about how you control judges, what judges are supposed to do, what you do as citizens if judges get out of control. This goes back to the original belief, and we kind of talked about it before the program started, but the Founding Fathers, one of the things that drove them early, 10 years before the American Revolution, was we have got to stop the British judicial activism. What those British judges are doing to us is taking power out of our own hands. And so they wrote a lot about it. And it is interesting that there is nothing new under the sun. The Bible says that, Ecclesiastes 1:9. Judicial activism is nothing new. And so what we do in that book is say, here's the standards. Here's what they gave us solutions. Here's how you fix this. Here's what judges are doing today. But we still have the same solutions we've had for 200 years if we'll just use them. They're in the Constitution.
So how do they get your book? I guess they can go to wallbuilders.com.
They go to wallbuilders.com. Once they get there, I think it may be on the front page, but certainly at the store. You can go to the store, and Restraining Judicial Activism is there. We've got videos that deal with this. Foundations of Freedom has some lessons on how to restrain judicial activism. So we have a lot there at the website.
And I know that our viewers are really being blessed by the things you're sharing. And I just want to say that David is one of the most knowledgeable people on this. And, he doesn't just say things like you hear the liberals lots of times will give these statements, but he backs everything up with footnotes. I mean, the footnotes that he has are just phenomenal. And it would be to your advantage to get these books and get these materials. So please check that out, wallbuilders.com. Have we got some questions, Karen?
We do. I just want to remind the audience, if you weren't here at the beginning, that the way that you submit your question is if you're on truthandliberty.net or Andrew Wommack Ministries website, you can just enter your question into chat, or if you're on one of the social media pages, you can just go ahead and put that in the timeline area, and those comments are forwarded to us. David, we've got a lot of questions coming in. These are definitely
I bet we stirred up some stuff.
Really good topics. Yeah. So just kind of, I think this is a good question to ask. A lot of times people will hear about Roe versus Wade or some of these things like taking the Bible out of schools. And those are examples of judicial activism or the interpretation of it. So Kara's dad asks this in chat: is it feasible that a private citizen could sue a court for indulging in judicial activism, and would it have to be a class action suit?
Wouldn't have to be a class action suit, but what you've got to do is show that you've been injured by it. If you can show an injury, then you can get a cause of action. Now, the weird thing about the government is it gives itself immunity. The government actually sets up what you can sue and when and how you go about it. And the government always gives itself immunity. In other words, you cannot sue the government unless the government gives you permission to sue the government. So there are some laws that grant causes, they're called causes of action that give you a way to sue. So part of it is there a cause of action? Have you suffered an injury where the law says that if you've suffered this injury, you can go into a court and do something about it? And you can't do it on a philosophical basis simply because I don't like what the judge did. I don't like that decision. It's actually Congress who's supposed to be able to control that.
Well, now time out just a second. Isn't that what a lot of the people that are doing, that are suing the government, because they say this cross offends me and it does me damage, and isn't that philosophical? It hadn't physically done anything.
And that's the deal. You have to show that it does you damage. And the key is, and this is just stupid, But the key is that if you belong to a minority, you're more likely to be injured than if you belong to a majority. So if you're a Christian, you're 72%. You can't be injured. Now, if you're Jewish at 1% or 1.6%, if you're Muslim, 1%, now you could be injured. No, the Constitution gives everyone equal rights, period. But the courts in 1993, in the case Lee versus Wiseman, came up with what they call the classes of religion. And the more adherence you have, the less protection you get. Well, that's crazy. It's a constitutional right. So that's why what happens, this used to be, I was involved in a lot of 10 Commandments cases back 10, 15, 20 years ago before the Supreme Court finally decided the issue. And what these guys would do, they would say, and the case that decided, it was called Perry versus Van Orden. It came out of Texas. It was the 10 Commandments monument of the Texas Capitol. And you had an atheist attorney who walked by, ACLU guy, as I recall, walked by and said, every time I see the 10 Commandments, I feel like I'm an outsider in my own country. And that was a key phrase, outsider in mine own country. I am discriminated against when I see the 10 Commandments. And that's how they always got those 10 Commandments cases in the court. All you had to say was, I'm an outsider in my own country. Now, I could say that, but I'm a white guy who's a Christian.
That gives you no rights.
I can't be an outsider. Well, yes, I can. So the answer is it's really hard. The bigger solution is you go through the legislative means. The Founding Fathers gave the legislature a lot of ways to control judges. I have worked with a number of congressmen who worked very actively to use those ways to control judges. What they found out was once they started moving the parade to get the judges, they looked behind them and none of the people were behind them. And so what happens is if the people don't come up and support the congressman, they're not really looking to get beat up by all the national media for being stupid if they don't have a movement behind them.
And I think that this kind of goes to the heart of why we're in the mess we're in, is because Christians, when they are treated wrong and somebody offends them, we don't sit here and dictate and retaliate. We turn the other cheek and let things go. But man, the other side, they take offense over the slightest little thing. And they will fight to the death over it. So they're more militant. We're more forgiving. In a way, that's to our detriment. And this is a jurisdictional thing. We are supposed to turn the other cheek as individuals. We're not supposed to turn the other cheek when it comes to justice. And justice is something that God mandates in a nation. And when you turn the other cheek on justice issues, you're doing a disservice to everyone else who suffers that injustice. And so we have found that when we can get a kid to stand up and fight for the right to pray at school, a superintendent says, you can't have a prayer at graduation. That kid says, I will sue the school. You know what? They win that suit, and now kids all over America can pray at graduations because somebody stood up and fought. Well, I'm in a similar situation where we had Tony Dungy come here, and he spoke at one of my conferences, and the mayor asked him to speak in the public school because he had a son that had committed suicide, and they had just had a boy commit suicide the week before. So the mayor asked him to go in, and they were going to allow him to do it, but they told him he could not mention God, they could not mention his faith, and Tony just says, well, if you don't give me the freedom to do that, I'm not going to speak. And so we've just let it go, but I've wondered if maybe we ought to press that issue. But man, it would make us the bad guys in Woodland Park if we did that.
Well, it'd make it bad guys in Woodland Park, but it would open the door for thousands of schools across America. And what happens is, in that case, I guarantee the school would have lost. We deal with 7 national legal groups who do this stuff for free. They would walk into that school with about 5 Supreme Court decisions and say, really? Do you really want us to take you out on this? Because this will cost you several $1 million and you're going to lose because here's all the decisions we won. See, you cannot pre-screen speech. You cannot tell people what they can and cannot say, and you cannot suppress their freedom of religion. All of that would have been easy. So
I think what we ought to do is contact these people, and when Tony comes back next year, we ought to try and set the thing up, and if there's any resistance, we'll go in before it happens and deal with that.
And let me just say this to everybody watching. You're going to see this around your own cities. They're going to say, you can't put in God we trust in the police cars. You can't have a national day of prayer. You can't have a see me at the poll or whatever. Somebody's going to object. When that happens, go to wallbuilders.com. Under the helpful links, there's a list of legal groups. Those legal groups all specialize in this. They do it for free. There are donors that give to them so they can defend these cases all over the nation. One of the groups we dealt with just this last week, their winning record is over 98%. If you get a legal group that wins 25%, that's considered a really good group. We're talking over 98% on these cases. So anybody out there, when this comes to you, you contact those legal groups. Just go online to one of those links. This is how we win the cases. I go to Proverbs 22:21. It says, the wise man attacks the city of the mighty, tears down a stronghold. You got to be offensive minded. The other guys are offensive minded. We have to get offensive minded.
Man, that's good.
So, David, if the citizens aren't allowed to really sue, for example, on a Roe versus Wade, what can we do to help facilitate that overturn, or at least consideration of the overturn?
Well, President Trump has already done a lot. We did a whole lot by electing a president who would put justices on there who would be willing to overturn it. Now, just consider this. If it does get overturned, what happens? Two things happen. Either abortion is illegal in all of America, which probably will not happen, or they will dump it back to the state level. So the question is, what kind of state legislators do you have in place ready to handle this? What kind of a state governor do you have in place ready to handle this? If you want to be pro-life, start looking down the road, because we have the things, we have the pieces in place right now to win this at the federal level. But if it comes back to the states, where are you? So start working right now to get the right people in office, get the right senators, get the right legislators, get the right governors. It's going to be 2 to 3 years before this gets back to the state level. That's one of the best things you can do to make a pro-life nation, is to make all 50 states pro-life.
And sadly, people who are involved in politics do it typically on a national level, not the local level, but that's where you can really make an impact.
That's true.
I tell you, the local level is where you'll make the most impact, because it takes fewer voters to get good people in office. It's easier to get good people elected locally. One of the things I love to point to is two recent local elections where that after President Obama said, hey, if you get federal funds, we want your school to have just one bathroom and one locker room. No boys, girls. We're all going to be together on this.
Man.
And across the nation, people started saying, no. We're doing boys and girls, not my kids do. And so we saw all these people start running for school board. And there was a school district up in Northwest Arkansas, a town of 40,000 people. Christian lady ran, said, we're not doing this in my school. She got elected, a town of 40,000 people. There were only 35 votes cast in the whole election.
Oh,
Wow.
And she won. There was another one in Iowa where the guy ran and said, you're not doing this in my district. He ran for school board. As it turned out, he got busy on election day. He did not vote for himself. But that's not the story. The story is not a single vote was cast in the school board election. Had he voted for himself, he would have been the entire school board.
Oh,
So
Oh, my goodness.
it's at the local level. And see, you elect these people to school board, then they're going to turn around and run for mayor at some point. They're going to run for state rep. They're going to run for state senator and run for governor. So you start building a farm team from the bottom up. You start recruiting people to run for local office and get them elected, because it's easy at the local level.
this is doable if
It
we could
is.
just get the people watching to get involved.
That's
You got
right.
some more questions?
I do. So Ishmael asks, and he's in chat, have there been any Supreme Court judges removed because of judicial activism?
Interesting. There have been none removed, but there's been a whole lot of federal court judges removed. And there was a Supreme Court justice impeached back in 1804 for judicial activism, among other things. But judicial activism has caused the removal. The founding fathers themselves removed several federal judges that they called it judicial high-handedness. One of them was removed for contradicting an act of Congress, which the courts do all the time now. So back in the day of the founding fathers, they were very quick to remove judges because, remember, original intent, they wrote those clauses to make sure you could keep judges under control and not be activists. Mm-hmm. And we got away from this in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. We had the law schools that were all progressive, and they said, oh, no, judges make policy, judges make law. And that's where you see the activism come on the courts. It's in the 1960s. So we've not done this in 50 years, but the Constitution has not changed. It's still there.
And I know that you'll be able to give us this exact quote, but Thomas Jefferson, I read about him, and he was saying that if this nation ever did fail, he thought it would be because of the judicial activism.
Yeah, he said the seeds of our dissolution are in the federal judiciary.
That's it.
And so he said, and he talked about if you ever let the judges have the final word on laws, then we will have become an oligarchy rather than a republic.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Jefferson was so good on what he said about judges and not letting them run the nation.
Awesome.
I've got another question here. Gordon asked, and he's also in chat, which means he's on our website, says, David, in lieu of the apparent deep state that seems to override our representative republic structure. What's your opinion of the Convention of States movement?
Let me address two things there. One is the deep state movement, and let me see if I can give a perspective on this. The Constitution says that for a law to become law, it has to go through the House and the Senate and be signed by the president, or he doesn't sign it and 10 days later it becomes law. But it's got to go through the House and Senate. I've got a friend in the U.S. Senate who has 2 stacks of stuff in his office. One is a stack of every law that has been passed by Congress. He puts it in one stack. Then every law that's been passed by the deep state through regulatory process, he puts in another stack. In the one stack, the laws passed by Congress, 127 laws, it's a little over 4 inches tall. And the other stack, the laws passed by the deep state, you have 3,800. It's a little over 14 feet tall.
Wow.
So the deep state is having much more control over the country than the constitutional side, but most people are not aware of that. Now, I will say to Trump's credit, he came in and said, I will not let you pass a new regulation, deep state, unless you repeal 2. And right now, for every one they passed, they're repealing 22. So it's moving in the right direction very much. So that now, Convention of States is something the Founding Fathers gave us in Article 5. Convention of States say that the federal government won't get its act together. The states can get together and propose constitutional amendments. And so that's what the Convention of States is. Typically, whenever you get to a Convention of States, usually you wake Congress up and they say, okay, let's not do that. We'll pass one. So we had the Convention of States 25 years ago calling for a balanced budget amendment. When it almost got to enough to have a Convention of States, Congress said, okay, we'll vote on the balanced budget amendment. And they voted, and it lost by 1 vote. Otherwise, we'd have a balanced budget amendment. So right now, there's a big movement to have a Convention of States. Who knows what amendments they might come out with, but it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify them, so there's not going to be many if they come out with any. One is a balanced budget amendment. They're looking at 1, term limits for judges. There's only 2 or 3 or 4 things they might do, but this is a way for the states to be able to push back. The Federalist Papers make it very clear that the states is one way to check and balance the federal government. And so I'm a supporter of the states using their constitutional tools to do what they can to limit the federal government.
And again, back to what we've already said, I believe that the majority of Americans are more conservative than the people that are in power. And so if something like that happened, it would probably be beneficial.
Yep.
That's great. Okay, Sue J. from chat says, it seems to me that the left has been using judicial activism for several years now. Why hasn't anyone done anything about it?
Well, the left has been using judicial activism for more than several years. You can go back to really 1947 is the first really indicator of what was coming. 1962 is the first really clear judicial activism case. And there have been a lot of people pushing back, but you have to understand that, let me see how I can explain this. Being from the country, if I see bad weeds start popping up here, growing in my pasture, I see the weeds, but I got to recognize they were planted much earlier than they popped up. And so if you start seeing bad stuff pop up out of the judiciary in the 1960s, you got to back up and say, when were those bad seeds planted? And you go back in the law schools from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. For 40 years, we were teaching bad stuff in law school. Those kids became graduates. They became established in law. They finally got appointed to the Supreme Court, and then they take it the wrong direction. So we should have been fighting this 100 years ago when progressives took over education in the 1920s. And that's where you see all this stuff coming from. So fighting it right now is not, you can't fight it just because we want to fight it. You have to fight it with education. I mean, if I asked most conservative people today, do federal judges have lifetime appointments? I guarantee you 99 out of 100 would say yes.
Absolutely.
The Constitution says otherwise. So our biggest problem is we do not know the tools we have at our disposal, and that's why we don't fight back. We keep leaving the weapons on the battlefield.
So, David, let me ask you a question. I know that the left has taken this tactic where they take the very things they're guilty of and accuse the others of doing it. So they are going to be throwing around this phrase judicial activism for Kavanaugh and his appointment, saying he's going to get in and he's going to change all of this. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. The left tends to be Romans 2:21. That accuses another condemneth thine own self also. And whatever they accuse others of is generally, when they accuse us of hate, that's because they hate us.
That's right.
When they accuse us of intolerance, it's because they have no tolerance for anybody that disagrees with them. So they will throw out judicial activism. At this point, it will make no difference. Mitch McConnell has said we will get him confirmed within 66 days. I think they will.
Now, how do they do that with all of the senators that are going to fight this?
Well, it is easy to pass the rules you can change the rules with a majority vote. And all they have to do is get a majority vote, and they have 51 votes in the Senate to get it done. They will start through it right now, and the Democrats can use every delaying tactic they want, but the time will run out on those delaying tactics. That's at Rule 22 type stuff. And so it will happen at some point that he will be confirmed this year. McConnell says he's going to shoot for 66 days. I think they can meet that. That is not at all an unusual time for a Supreme Court justice, although I will point that in a number of presidential administrations, there were a number of justices who were nominated and confirmed on the same day. So wow. 0 time. So that's the way it had been. It really changed in the modern era is when we started getting into these 40, 50, 60, 80, 100-day confirmations. Back originally, it didn't take much time at all. We didn't have
Clarence
all the
Thomas,
stuff we
boy,
have.
they gave him a terrible
I remember
time.
that.
I remember all that.
That was
Yeah,
tough.
Clarence Thomas, bless his heart, man. He's one of the best justices we have, and if he could have sued for defamation, man, he could have made a ton on that.
All right, this is probably the last question
Yeah.
here.
Okay, John in chat asks, David, you have said Lincoln ignored the Supreme Court at least once. Has anything changed legally or judiciously since then disallowing such action?
No, nothing has changed. That still is a tool. That's one of the checks and balances. You had Thomas Jefferson do that. You had James Madison ignore the Supreme Court. You had Andrew Jackson ignore the Supreme Court. You had Abraham Lincoln ignore the Supreme Court. It's been done. So many presidents did that because the Supreme Court is not the only body that can read and understand the Constitution. The president takes an oath to read and uphold the Constitution. The House and Senate take the oath to read and uphold the Constitution. Nobody takes an oath that says, I'm going to uphold the Supreme Court decisions. That's not the oath you take. And so if the president reads the Constitution and says, the court, you've got it wrong, that's one of our checks and balances. He can say, I'm not going to do that. And so when the Supreme Court said, oh, blacks are not people, they're property, and you can't free them because you can't free property.
That was a Dred Scott case.
Dred Scott. Lincoln said, good news, that's only the Supreme Court. I'm ignoring that. And so he ended up giving the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in D.C., et cetera. So, yeah, great question, and that's still a tool at our disposal. But again, if you ask most Americans if the president can ignore the Supreme Court, most would tell you, no way. He's got to follow what the Supreme Court says.
It goes back to an education problem again. And
it is.
Basically, people believe that the Supreme Court has the trump, that they can overcome anybody.
Anything. Do you know,
the Supreme Court does have the trump. He's put 2 justices on it.
I thought of that when I said it.
Do you know, speaking of education, David, why don't you share with everybody what you're doing with teachers and legislators and students?
Yeah, one of the things we do with teachers, for example, is, again, around behind me, we have these 120,000 documents. We do teacher training sessions. Teachers come in from across the nation, university professors, and we have presidents of colleges, and we have superintendents and teachers and whatever. And we go through 3-day training sessions here where they handle all this stuff, and it just revolutionizes what they've been taught because now they're seeing with their own eyes. So we do that. We have a network of about 1,000 legislators. We get together once a year, do a lot of work with legislators, give them tools to be able to go back and work with their state constitutions, et cetera. So we do a lot with pastor training and with youth training, students 18 through 25 in college, going to college or getting a master's or doctorate. We do a lot of training with teachers and a lot of training with legislators. People are welcome to be part of any of that. They can go to wallbuilders.com, get the programs there, see what we have, sign up for that, be part of it, or contribute to it if you want to.
Well, David, I know that there's others doing things, but man, you are one of the leaders, and we just appreciate everything you're doing. And thank you so much for being a part of our Truth and Liberty. You are a blessing, brother.
A blessing.
It's awesome.
Andrew, appreciate you, brother. Thanks for all you're doing at Karis as well. God bless you.
And for those of you that don't know, David is the one that started our 3rd year practical government school. He's the one that wrote the curriculum. We're using a lot of the curriculum from back in the 1800s at least. And He is a regular speaker at our Bible college. Man, if you want to know these things, you can go directly to his website. You can take advantage of these seminars that he's talking about, the tour of the Capitol. But you can also come to Charis Bible College and go to our practical government school. And you'll get to hear David and his son Tim. He is just exactly the same.
He is.
It's a blessing.
My goodness.
So David, again, thanks for being with us. We appreciate you and love what you're doing, brother. It's a blessing.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you guys much.
All right,
Bless you.
and thank all of you for watching. And again, next Monday night, we're going to be back with another Truth and Liberty. And I tell you, I believe it's really good. It'll give you a different perspective that you aren't getting through any of the news media. And I believe it'll be a blessing to you. So God bless you. Thanks, Karen, for being with us. God bless you all.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week.
Join us next time for the Truth and Liberty broadcast. View previous live casts with related articles and links on our website. Get updates on Truth and Liberty and Seven Mountain Ventures at truthandliberty.net.